She came to Blackridge with $43, a cracked leather trunk, and a letter from a man she'd never met. And within 24 hours, she'd already figured out that the man's ranch wasn't dying because of bad luck. It was being murdered, slowly, by people he trusted. What Marin Holloway did next would change everything for Gideon Ashcroft, for his daughter, for every rancher in the valley who'd been too afraid to ask the questions she wasn't afraid to ask. This is the story of a woman who had nothing left to lose and used that freedom to fight for something worth keeping. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in, because we're just getting started. The train depot at Blackridge was the kind of place that made you feel the distance. Not just the miles you'd traveled, but the distance between who you used to be and whoever you'd have to become to survive what was coming next. Marin Holloway stepped off the last car of the afternoon train, carrying a trunk that weighed more than it looked, and a traveling bag with a broken clasp she'd been meaning to fix since October. She was 28 years old, brown hair, wind-burned cheeks, hands that had stopped being soft sometime around her 20th birthday. She wasn't beautiful in any way that stopped a room, but she had a steadiness in her eyes that people noticed after a minute or two. The kind of steadiness that either meant deep confidence or deep damage, and sometimes both. The platform was half covered in old snow that had turned gray and hard at the edges. A man in a railroad coat was stacking crates without looking at anyone. Two women near the station door watched Marin with undisguised interest, the way you watch a stranger arrive somewhere and already know the story isn't going to end the way they expect. She set her trunk down and pulled the letter from her coat pocket. She'd read it enough times she could have recited it, but she read it again anyway. Miss Holloway, my name is Gideon Ashcroft. I run sheep on 300 acres outside Blackridge, Montana territory. I am a widower with a daughter, age 7. I am not a man of words, so I will be direct. I need a capable woman who can manage a household and assist with ranch work. I can offer a home, meals, and a fair arrangement. If you're willing to come and try, I'll send the fare. G. Ashcroft. That was the whole letter. No promises, no poetry, no attempt to make it sound like anything other than what it was. She'd answered it because she had $43, a cracked trunk, and the ruins of a life that had fallen apart in ways she wasn't entirely willing to talk about yet. She'd answered it because it was honest, because it didn't dress up desperation in nicer clothes than it deserved. She folded the letter and put it back in her pocket. A buckboard wagon was parked at the far end of the depot lot, a bay horse standing with its head low in the cold. The man holding the reins was not what she'd expected, though she wasn't entirely sure what she had expected. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, tall enough that sitting in the wagon still put him above most people standing. Dark hair under a battered hat, a jaw that looked like it had been carved with a dull instrument. He was watching her with the kind of caution you use when you've been surprised badly before and have decided not to let it happen again. She walked toward him. He didn't climb down to help with the trunk. Marin Holloway? He said. Yes? Gideon Ashcroft. He said it like he was reading his own name off a wanted poster. The trunk goes in the back. She lifted her end. He climbed down after a moment and took the other side without comment. They loaded it in silence. She got up onto the wagon seat and he climbed back up, and they pulled out of the depot lot without exchanging another word for several minutes. The town of Blackridge passed by on either side. It wasn't much. A main street with a general store, a feed merchant, a bank with new paint that looked wrong against everything around it, a saloon that was doing business even at 4 in the afternoon. A few people on the boardwalk stopped to watch the wagon pass. Marin kept her eyes forward. How far's the ranch? She asked. 6 miles. Road's rough the last 2. All right. He glanced at her sideways, just once. She didn't turn to catch it. The town thinned out and then disappeared, and they were on open land. Flat grassland rolling toward a line of hills in the north, snow still covering most of it. The late afternoon sky going that particular shade of pale gray that comes just before hard cold settles in for the night. The wind cut sideways across the plain without apology. Marin pulled her coat tighter. Has it been this cold long? Since November, worst winter in 12 years, people say. He paused. Lost 40 sheep. She turned to look at him. Out of how many? I've got 160 left. Had 203 in October. That was a serious number. She did the arithmetic quickly. Almost a fifth of the herd gone in a single winter. What to? Cold, sickness. Some of them just... He stopped. Started again. Some just quit. She nodded slowly. She understood that. Sometimes things just quit. The wagon hit a rut, and they both lurched. He straightened without expression. She gripped the seat and said nothing. They came over a low rise, and she saw it for the first time. The Ashcroft Ranch. 300 acres, he'd said. She could see the boundary fence in the distance, and it was in worse shape than she'd imagined. Posts leaning, wire sagging, or missing in sections. The main house was a 2-story structure that had been decent once and was now mostly memory. A barn in fair condition. Several outbuildings that were in various states of losing their argument with gravity. A small face appeared in the farmhouse window when the wagon pulled into the yard. There for a second, then gone. "That's Elsie," Gideon said, and something shifted in his voice when he said it, just briefly, like a door opening a crack before someone thought better of it. "How old did you say she was?" 7. She's... He stepped down from the wagon. "She's quiet. Don't take it personal." "I won't." She climbed down herself and stood in the yard, looking around. The barn was the best maintained thing on the property, by far. Whatever else had fallen away, he'd kept the barn. She filed that away. The front door of the house opened and a woman appeared, older, maybe 55, with a capable look about her and a dish towel in her hand. "Mrs. Pelham," Gideon said. "This is Marin Holloway. She's come to..." He stopped, apparently unsure how to finish that sentence. "I've come to help with the house and the ranch work," Marin said. Mrs. Pelham looked her up and down with the frank assessment of someone who has seen promises broken more times than she can count. "You're thinner than I expected." "I've had a difficult year." "Most people out here have." She stepped back from the door. "Come in then. There's supper. Us." The inside of the house was not quite as bad as the outside had suggested, but it was close. The kitchen was functional, the stove working, the floors swept but not scrubbed. The parlor had furniture that had been good 20 years ago. Everything had that particular quality of a space that was being maintained just barely, enough to keep going, not enough to actually improve. Marin carried her traveling bag inside. The trunk could wait for morning. Supper was beans and salt pork and cornbread, which was fine. Mrs. Pelham had been cooking for the household 3 evenings a week, she explained, but wouldn't be able to continue. Her own husband needed her home more now that his knee had gotten bad. That, apparently, was the specific crisis that had driven Gideon Ashcroft to place the arrangement advertisement in the Territory Gazette. Elsie sat across the table and ate with careful attention to her plate. She was small for 7, slight, with her father's dark hair and a watchfulness that didn't belong on a child that age. She didn't speak during supper, didn't refuse to speak exactly, just didn't offer anything. Marin didn't push. She'd been a child once who didn't want to speak at supper, and she remembered how it felt to have adults push anyway. After Mrs. Pelham left, Gideon showed Marin the room she'd be using, a small space off the kitchen, barely big enough for the narrow bed and a dresser, with a single window that looked out toward the barn. It was clean, cold, but clean. Someone had put a quilt on the bed that looked handmade, and Marin wondered if that had been his wife's work. "There's a second stovepipe that runs up from the kitchen," Gideon said. "Keeps this room from freezing, mostly." "It's fine," she said. "Thank you." He stood in the doorway for a moment, his hat still in his hands. She noticed he'd taken it off somewhere between the wagon and the kitchen and hadn't quite known where to put it since. "I want to be clear about something," he said. I know this isn't a normal situation." "No," she agreed. "It's not. I'm not looking for..." He stopped, started over. "What I mean is I need help, someone capable, someone who won't fall apart when it gets hard. It gets hard. I understand that. The ranch is in debt. The herd is in poor shape. I can't promise you this turns around." She looked at him steadily. "Mr. Ashcroft, I answered your letter because I have nothing behind me worth going back to. I'm not here because I expect things to be easy. I'm here because hard is better than nothing." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't name. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of recognition. "All right," he said. He put his hat on the dresser. "Get some rest. I start before dawn." He left. She listened to his footsteps down the hall. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and looked at the wall. Through the window, the barn's silhouette was black against the darkening sky. She could hear the sheep very faintly, that low, restless sound a flock makes when it settles in for the night. She wasn't afraid. That was the strange thing. She'd been afraid of the train ride, afraid of the territory, afraid of meeting a stranger and trying to build something with him. But now that she was here, in this cold little room, in this failing house on this struggling ranch, the fear had gone quiet. What she felt instead was closer to purpose. She woke before Gideon did. Not intentionally. She'd always been an early riser. It was just how she was built. She dressed in the dark, found the kitchen by feel, got the stove going, and put water on before she'd been awake 10 minutes. By the time she heard Gideon's boots on the stairs, there was coffee. He stopped at the kitchen doorway, looked at the stove, looked at her. "I figured out the coffee," she said. "I didn't touch anything else yet." "There's oats in the tin by the window." She made oats. They ate in the kind of silence that wasn't yet comfortable, but wasn't hostile either. The silence of two strangers figuring out the shape of something. After breakfast, he took her out to the barn. The sheep were housed in two large pens along the north wall, a reasonable setup protected from the worst of the winter wind. They were Rambouillet crosses. She could see that immediately, and in better years they'd have been something to be proud of. Fine-wooled animals, heavier frames than most range sheep, built for exactly this kind of cold-weather country. The problem was visible in the way they stood. Too many of them hunched, heads low, the listless quality of animals that had been under stress for too long. Marin moved slowly along the pen fence, watching. Not touching anything, just watching. "You know sheep?" Gideon asked from behind her. "Some. My grandfather ran a small flock in Pennsylvania when I was young. I've been reading." "Reading?" She glanced at him. "Is that a problem?" "No," he paused. "Just most people around here learn from doing. I plan to do that too, but reading first doesn't hurt." She studied the flock for another few minutes. Then she pointed to a group of 6 ewes clustered near the far wall. "Those ones. They're thin compared to the others. Has that been consistent all winter, or—" "They lost lambs early in November," he said, his voice going flat. "Got separated from the barn in a storm. I found them." He stopped. "Found 3 of the lambs too late. Those 6 haven't been right since." "Grief," she said. He looked at her. "Sheep grieve," she said. "It sounds like a strange thing to say, but they do. Those animals are grieving, on top of whatever physical strain they're carrying from the winter." She watched the 6 ewes. They need more feed than the others right now, not less, and they need to be kept together. Separating them further would make it worse. Gideon was quiet for a moment. "The man I've been dealing with for feed, Holt Fenner, runs the merchant on the east side of town. He told me to cut rations for the weak animals. Said you throw good feed after bad." Marin turned to look at him. "That's wrong," she said. It came out more direct than she'd planned, but she didn't soften it. "That's almost exactly wrong. A healthy animal can tolerate lower rations for a short period. A stressed, grieving animal with compromised immunity needs more nutrition, not less, or you lose them to secondary illness." Gideon's jaw worked. She could see him deciding whether to take offense or take the information. "Fenner's been dealing with ranchers out here for 20 years, he said. "That doesn't mean he's right about sheep nutrition." She turned back to the pen. "I'm not trying to be difficult, Mr. Ashcroft. I'm telling you what I know. You can do what you want with it." He was quiet for a long moment. "Gideon," he said finally. She turned. "Call me Gideon." "The Mr. Ashcroft thing." He shook his head. "My father was Mr. Ashcroft. Most of the time people called him that right before they told him something bad." "All right," she said. "Gideon." He looked at the 6 grieving ewes, looked at Marin, back at the ewes. "I'll increase their ration," he said quietly. She spent the rest of that first day taking stock. Not just the sheep, though she spent 2 hours in the barn with a pencil and a small notebook she'd brought with her, working through the herd by pen and making notes on each animal's condition. That itself told her things. She was the first person who'd done this in a while, maybe ever. The ewes had no individual records, no notes on which ones had lambed, which had health problems, which produced better wool. Gideon worked his flock by sight and instinct and memory, and when winter hit hard and memory got confused, there was nothing to fall back on. She also walked the fences. 2 miles she walked that afternoon, following the boundary fence along the north and east sides of the property. She found 11 sections that were compromised, posts that had heaved out of the frozen ground, wire that had snapped under ice weight, 3 places where the gap was wide enough for sheep to wander through if they were inclined. She wrote all of it down. When she came back to the house at late afternoon, her boots were soaked through and she couldn't feel her left foot properly. She sat by the kitchen stove and waited for feeling to come back while Elsie watched her from the parlor doorway with the careful attention of a child assessing a new situation. "Did you walk the north fence?" Elsie said. "Yes." "Papa says it needs fixing." "He's right. It does." Elsie came one step closer to the doorway. Mrs. Pelham wouldn't go out in the cold. She said the cold was for men and cattle. That seems like a difficult position to hold on a sheep ranch. Elsie almost smiled. Almost. She turned and disappeared back into the parlor. Marin looked at the doorway for a moment. Then she went back to her notes. She didn't sleep well her second night. Her mind kept working. She'd been turning over something Gideon had said at supper, a passing comment about what he'd been paid for last year's wool clip. 62 cents a pound. She'd kept her expression neutral, but inside she'd felt something sharp and cold that wasn't the weather. 62 cents a pound for Rambouillet Cross fine wool was wrong. Not somewhat wrong. Badly, inexplicably wrong. She'd studied the wool market before she came. She wasn't an expert, but she'd done her reading. It was the thing she'd had time for in the long weeks between answering Gideon's letter and boarding the train. Fine wool from this type of animal, properly skirted and in good condition, was trading between 90 cents and $1.10 in the major markets. Even accounting for freight and the buyer's margin, 62 cents didn't make sense, unless someone was buying it wrong on purpose. She lay in the dark and thought about Holt Fenner, who ran the merchant on the east side of town and who had told Gideon to cut rations for his weakest animals. Fenner, who had apparently been the primary broker for the Ashcroft wool clip for several years. She thought about the feed account she'd found in the kitchen drawer while she was looking for a pencil. Old receipts going back 4 years showing what the ranch had paid for grain and hay. The numbers were high, higher than they should have been for the quantity received, based on current prices she knew. She thought about the ranch's debt, which Gideon had mentioned in a vague, heavy way that suggested he didn't fully understand the terms. She got up at 3 in the morning, lit the lamp in her room with the wick turned low, and spent 2 hours with the handful of financial papers she'd found and the notebook she'd brought and a pencil she sharpened with her pocket knife. By 5 o'clock, when she needed to get up to start the stove, she was fairly certain she understood the shape of it. The Ashcroft Ranch wasn't failing because Gideon was incompetent or unlucky. It was failing because for years someone had been quietly taking money out of it through overpriced goods and undervalued wool, and no one had ever looked carefully enough to see it. She closed the notebook. She put it in the pocket of her dress. She went to start the stove. It took her 3 days to understand why no one in Blackridge had said anything. Some of it was simple. The ranchers in this valley were men who'd learned to trust their merchants and middlemen because their fathers had trusted them. That was how things worked out here. You dealt with who you'd always dealt with because the alternative was doing business with strangers, and strangers were a gamble. Some of it was something else. She understood the something else on the 4th afternoon when she went to the general store for supplies and ran into 2 women from town, a Mrs. Garland and a younger woman named Cecily, the feed merchant's daughter-in-law. They were polite enough, in the careful, watching way of people who haven't decided yet how they feel about you. "You're settling in, then?" Mrs. Garland asked. "Getting started," Marin said. She was examining bolts of cloth she didn't actually need, just to give herself a reason to stay in the aisle. "Most folks thought Gideon would bring someone more local." Cecily said it with a smile that didn't mean anything kind. "Someone who knows the territory." "I'm learning the territory." "It's different out here, different than wherever you're from." She said, "wherever you're from," with a slight emphasis, like it covered a category of not quite right. "I imagine it is," Marin agreed pleasantly. She paid for her supplies and left. She walked back to the wagon and sat with her hands in her lap for a moment before she picked up the reins. Different. That was the word they'd use. The word that meant, you don't belong here, and when you fail, we won't be surprised. She'd heard that word in different forms her whole life. Different wasn't an obstacle. Different was just a description, a starting point. She picked up the reins and started back toward the ranch. On the fifth evening, she found Gideon in the barn after supper, sitting on an overturned crate near the pen that held the grieving ewes. Just sitting, not doing anything in particular, just keeping them company in the dark. She almost left without saying anything. It seemed like a private moment, but then she thought about the notebook in her pocket and what she'd spent 4 nights confirming, and she came in and sat on the stool near the grain bin. "I need to talk to you about something," she said. He looked at her. He had a tiredness about him that went deeper than one bad winter. "Go ahead." She took the notebook out. She opened it to the 3rd page where she'd done the clearest version of the arithmetic. "What did you pay for grain this winter? From Fenner's?" He rubbed the back of his neck. $28 for the last delivery. Before that, I'd have to look. I looked. I found your receipts. She held up the notebook. "You've been paying roughly 30% above the going rate for grain for at least 4 years. I checked the prices against the territory agricultural record and against what the general store charges." He was very still. "And the wool," she said, 62 cents a pound. "Gideon, fine wool from Rambouillet crosses is selling at 90 cents to $1.10. Even after taking freight and margin, you should have been receiving at least 78 to 85 cents. That's not a rounding difference. Over 4 years on your clip size," she pointed to the bottom of the page, "you've been shorted by something between $600 and $800, maybe more." The barn was very quiet. One of the ewes shifted in the pen. Gideon sat with his hands hanging between his knees and said nothing for a long time. "You're sure," he said finally, "about the prices, yes. I can't prove what Fenner has been doing with the difference, but the numbers are real." He stood up. He walked to the barn door and stood looking out at the dark yard and the colder dark beyond it. She waited. "My wife's father," he said. "He set up the arrangement with Fenner before we married. He trusted him." His voice was very quiet. "After Clara died, I had Elsie. I had the flock. I had all of it. And I kept going the way things were set up because I didn't have the—" He stopped. "I didn't have the attention." "You were grieving," she said. "That's no excuse for stupidity. It's not stupidity to trust someone your family trusted. It's just trust." She paused. "The stupid thing would be to keep trusting him now." He turned from the door and looked at her. In the lamplight, his face was hard to read, but she could see the way he was working through it. The anger, the embarrassment, the something that comes after those 2 things when you're a man who takes pride in taking care of what's his. "What are you suggesting?" he said. "I'm suggesting we don't do anything yet," she said carefully. "The wool clip is late spring. That's months away. We have time to find out who the other buyers are, the legitimate buyers, and to understand what your clip is actually worth. And in the meantime, we source grain elsewhere. Fenner will notice if I stop ordering." "Let him notice." She held his gaze. "He's been taking money out of this ranch for years, Gideon. He's going to notice a lot of things before we're done." He looked at her for a long moment. The lamp between them threw shadows up along the barn walls. "You came here 3 weeks ago," he said slowly. 5 days ago." 5 days, he said. 5 days and you've gone through my accounts and—" He stopped. She could see him deciding how to feel about this. "I don't know if I should be angry that you went through my papers or—" "You should decide that for yourself," she said evenly. "I went through your financial records because I needed to understand the situation I'd arrived in. I wasn't trying to intrude on anything private. If I was wrong to do it, tell me and I won't do it again." He was quiet. "No," he said finally. "No, you were right to do it." He said it like the words cost him something. "I should have done it years ago." "You had reasons you didn't." He looked at her for another long moment. She couldn't tell what he was thinking. With some men, you could read them like a clear stream. You could see right to the bottom. With Gideon Ashcroft, it was more like looking at river water in the early morning, something moving underneath, but the light not quite right for seeing what. "All right," he said. "We'll do it your way." She nodded. She closed the notebook and put it back in her pocket. "The 6 grieving ewes," she said as she stood up. "I checked them this afternoon. 2 of them are showing signs of improvement. The extra ration is helping." She thought she saw something shift in his face, something very small. "Good," he said. "That's good." She went back to the house. Behind her, she could hear him settling back on the crate in the lamplight, keeping watch over his animals in the quiet dark. She stood on the porch for a moment before going inside. The cold was hard and clear, and the stars out here were something she hadn't been prepared for. Nothing between them and the earth, all that light spilling down with nowhere else to go. She'd told Gideon it would be months before the wool clip. She hadn't told him the other thing she'd been thinking about, the thing that had been sitting at the back of her mind since she did the arithmetic. $600. $800. Maybe more. That was enough to make someone fight hard to keep it going. Enough to make someone take steps to protect an arrangement they'd had for years, if they felt it was being threatened. She was going to have to be careful. She was also going to have to be effective, which mattered more than careful in her experience, though it helped to be both. She opened the door and went inside. Chametz. 2 weeks in, Elsie spoke to her at breakfast. Not much. 3 sentences about a cat that used to live in the barn and had disappeared sometime in autumn. A gray tom named Captain, who had kept the mouse population in check and been Elsie's particular companion since before her mother died. The sentences came out carefully, like Elsie was testing the weight of each word before she set it down. Marin listened without making too much of it. Cats sometimes come back, she said, especially if they left in autumn. They sometimes wait out the winter somewhere else and come back when the cold breaks. Do you think Captain did that? I don't know. I hope so. Elsie went back to her oats. Then, without looking up, He might have, Marin agreed. It wasn't much, but in the way of things that matter, it was a start. By the end of her 3rd week, the farmhouse smelled different. She hadn't done anything dramatic. She'd simply cleaned things systematically, 1 room at a time, and organized the kitchen so that everything had a place, and fixed the hinge on the root cellar door that had been sticking, and found where the cold air was getting in around the north-facing window and stuffed it with rags until they could get proper weather stripping. She'd made curtains for Elsie's room out of a bolt of blue cloth from the general store. Not fancy, just curtains, so the room had some color. She didn't make a production of any of it. She just did it, the way you do things when you decide a place is worth doing things for. Gideon noticed. She could tell he noticed. There was a quality to his silence on the evenings when she'd completed something, a particular quality that wasn't dismissal, but wasn't quite expression either. Like someone watching a season change and not wanting to say anything too soon, in case they were wrong about what it meant. She wasn't asking him to say anything. She wasn't doing any of it for his noticing. She was doing it because it needed doing. Because the ranch needed to be a functional, organized place before it could be a profitable one. Because Elsie needed curtains. And because Marin Holloway had made a decision somewhere on that cold porch on her first night in Black Ridge that she was not leaving. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She had $43 when she'd arrived. She had a cracked trunk and a broken bag clasp and years of bad luck and the wreckage of a previous life she was still picking through in the quiet parts of her mind. But she also had a pencil and a notebook and the ability to do arithmetic and a stubbornness that had been called a character flaw so many times it had just started to feel like a personality. And she had the beginning of something, fragile, uncertain, cold at the edges, the way everything out here was cold, that she thought might, given time and work and the kind of honesty that doesn't flinch, become something neither she nor Gideon had been willing to name yet. Outside, the plains ran flat and white to the horizon. The sheep settled in the barn. The stars came out in their thousands, doing what they'd done every night for longer than anyone could count. Marin Holloway put a log on the kitchen fire and sat down with her notebook and kept working. The notebook stayed in her pocket through February like a second heartbeat. She added to it every few days, prices she'd confirmed through the Territory Agricultural Circular that the general store received and left in a stack by the door, wool grades she'd cross-referenced against a buyer's catalog she'd ordered from a trading house in Billings, feed costs from 3 different merchants she'd written to, 2 in neighboring towns and 1 as far as Helena. The letters had cost her money she didn't really have, but the information that came back was worth it. Rambouillet cross-fine wool. 91 cents to $1.08, depending on clip quality and skirting. That was the real number. That was what the market was actually paying. 62 cents was theft dressed up as commerce. She didn't tell Gideon the full extent of what she was building in that notebook. Not yet. He knew the basic shape of it. They'd had that conversation in the barn, and he'd agreed to stop ordering grain from Fenner's merchant house. But she could see how the knowledge sat on him, heavy and uncomfortable, the way information does when it makes you feel like a fool for not seeing it sooner. She didn't want to pile more on top of that until she had something solid to hand him along with it. Evidence wasn't just numbers on a page. Evidence was a plan. So she kept the notebook and she kept her own counsel, and she did what needed doing in the meantime. What needed doing was considerable. The house had stopped being merely functional and was becoming something closer to a home, which was a distinction that mattered more than Marin would have predicted. She'd thought of herself as a practical woman. She was a practical woman, but she'd underestimated how much the small things accumulated. A proper latch on the pantry door, a hook by the front entrance where Gideon could hang his hat without having to carry it into the kitchen, a system for the root cellar that meant you could find the winter squash without moving everything else first. Elsie's curtains had stayed blue, but Marin had added a second panel on the east side of the room to block the morning glare that had apparently been waking the girls since autumn. Elsie hadn't said anything about the second curtain panel, but she'd come down to breakfast that morning without the dark circles under her eyes that Marin had been watching worsen all through January. The sheep were a different matter, and in some ways a more urgent one. Through February, Marin spent at least 2 hours in the barn every day. She'd built a system for herself, moving through the flock methodically, pen by pen, watching for anything that had changed since her last visit. She was keeping records now. Which ewes were gaining condition, which were holding steady, which were still worrying her. The 6 grieving animals from the north pen were doing better. Not completely recovered, she doubted they'd ever fully recover before lambing season gave them something new to focus their attention on, but better. 2 of them had started eating with something closer to appetite than resignation. She was watching one of those 2, a particular ewe she'd taken to thinking of privately as number 4 because she was the 4th one from the gate. When Gideon came into the barn on a Wednesday afternoon in the middle of February and stood beside her at the pen fence without saying anything for a moment. "You're in here a lot," he said. "Someone needs to be." He leaned against the fence post. He had a way of doing that, leaning against things, that made him look like he was part of whatever structure he was leaning on, like he'd been there longer than the building. "I've been thinking about what you said," he said. "About Fenner." "And?" "I went through the receipts myself last night." He was quiet for a second, after Elsie was asleep. She waited. "You're right about the grain prices," he said. "I checked against what Caldwell's is charging. That's the general store they carry some feed, and the difference is real." He said it flat and simple, the way you say things when you've decided the only way through them is to say them plainly. "I don't know how I missed it." "You were managing everything alone," she said. "The ranch, Elsie, the grief. People miss things when they're carrying all of that." "That's generous of you." "It's accurate. Generous would be pretending there was nothing to miss." He made a short sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You don't soften things much, do you?" "Is that a problem?" He thought about it, which she appreciated. He didn't just say no because it was the obvious answer. He actually thought about it. "No," he said. "I've had enough of things being softened." She nodded. "Then here's another one. I've been writing letters to wool buyers in Billings and Miles City. I haven't committed to anything. I wanted to know who else is out there. What the process looks like if we wanted to go a different route this spring." He looked at her. "You've been doing that for how long?" 3 weeks. He was quiet again. She watched number 4 move toward the hay rack and begin eating with the slow, deliberate quality of an animal that has decided life is, tentatively, worth continuing. "You should have told me," he said. "You're right. I should have." She meant it. "I was trying to build it out further before I brought it to you. I didn't want to hand you half an idea." "I'd rather have the half idea. It's my ranch." "Fair enough," she said. "That won't happen again." He accepted that without making more of it, which she respected. Some people, when they'd made a point and the other person conceded it, needed to win the point a second time. Gideon wasn't like that. He stated what was true and then moved on. "What did the buyers say?" he said. "One of them, a man named Aldrich, trading house in Billings, sent a price sheet. I wrote back asking about his terms for direct purchase. We haven't heard yet, but the prices he listed were 93 cents at base for Rambouillet fine. That's before they've graded the actual clip." Gideon stared at the sheep in front of them. "That's 30 cents more than Fenner's been paying." "Yes." "For 4 years." "Yes." The barn was quiet, except for the sound of sheep moving and feeding and the wind working at the walls outside. Gideon took his hat off and held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment, the way men do when they don't trust their faces to stay still and need something to look at instead. All right, he said finally. Keep writing the letters. Show me everything you get back. I will. He put his hat back on and straightened. I'm going to go fix the east gate. The latch froze again. He left. Marin watched him go, then turned back to number 4, who had finished her mouthful and was standing in the February light with her ears up, looking at nothing in particular, just standing in the light, which was its own kind of recovery. The cold that month was punishing in a different way than January had been. January was brutal and obvious, the kind of cold that announces itself like a man kicking in a door. February was worse in the sense that it was relentless. The temperature didn't swing wildly, it just stayed low and stayed there week after week, the sky a flat gray that pressed down on everything. The snow crusted hard and blue-white in the morning and blue-gray in the afternoon and black at night. Marin had grown up in Pennsylvania winters, which were cold enough, but this was something different. This cold had no manners. It came under doors and through wall gaps and down chimneys and found your hands no matter how many layers you'd put on them. She went through 2 pairs of work gloves in February alone, wearing the fingers through because she refused to stay inside and do half the things that needed doing. The sheep felt it worse than she did. The stress of the long winter was cumulative. Every animal in the flock was carrying a physical debt of months of cold and short rations and the particular exhaustion that comes from keeping warm. When keeping warm takes everything you have. She started watching for signs of respiratory illness, which was the biggest risk in a herd that had been under this kind of sustained strain. She asked Gideon about the local veterinarian, and he told her there wasn't one in Blackridge. The nearest was a man named Dr. Pruitt in Dalton, 2 hours south. Has he treated sheep before? I think so. I've never needed him for the flock. We might need him before spring. I want to know who he is and what his rates are before we're in a crisis. Gideon gave her a look that was somewhere between exasperated and relieved. The look of someone who hasn't thought 3 steps ahead in a long time and keeps being surprised to find someone else doing it. I'll write him, he said. She watched Elsie through February the way she'd been watching the sheep, methodically, without making it obvious, paying attention to small changes. The girl had opened up a little in January, but February seemed to close her back down again. Marin didn't push. She kept the routine steady. Breakfast at the same time, supper at the same time, the same quiet presence in the kitchen, and the same lack of demands. She made sure there was always something warm when Elsie came in from whatever she'd been doing, and she didn't ask questions when Elsie didn't want to talk, and she didn't pretend not to notice when Elsie was sad. The breakthrough, when it came, was about the wrong thing entirely. It was a Thursday, late afternoon, and Marin was at the kitchen table working through her notebook. She'd been comparing the lambing records Gideon had kept in a loose, inconsistent way over the years, trying to construct something usable out of them. When Elsie came in from outside with mud on her boots and something cupped in her hands, "Don't let it go," Elsie said, which was not a sentence that made any sense until Marin looked up and saw what she was holding, a small, bedraggled sparrow, barely moving. "Found it by the barn," Elsie said. "It's not dead." Marin set the notebook down. She looked at the bird without moving toward it. "It's in shock, cold probably, maybe flew into the barn wall." "What do I do?" "Warmth first. Keep it cupped in your hands. Your body heat. Sit close to the stove." She got up and moved a chair. "Slowly. Don't squeeze." Elsie sat down and held the bird with the absolute focused care of a child who has decided something matters and has no patience for anything getting in the way. She watched its face. Marin went and got a small wooden crate from the pantry and lined it with a torn piece of cloth. She set it near the stove, not too close. "Is it going to live?" Elsie asked. "Maybe. Probably. If it isn't too far gone." She paused. "Some of them recover fine. Some of them look like they're coming back and then don't make it. It's hard to know ahead of time." Elsie looked at her. "You don't lie to me." It was said simply, not as an accusation, not even really as a compliment, more as an observation, like the girl was noting a fact she'd gathered and was now confirming. "No," Marin said. "I don't see the point." Elsie looked back at the bird. After a moment, she said quietly, "Mama used to do that too. Most people would have said, yes, it'll be fine." Marin sat down across from her. She didn't say anything right away. The stove was warm and the kitchen smelled like the potato soup she had simmering, and outside the February wind was doing what it always did. She sounds like someone worth remembering, Marin said. She was. Elsie's voice was matter-of-fact in the way that children's voices are sometimes matter-of-fact about painful things, because they haven't yet learned to dress the pain up differently. Papa doesn't talk about her. Sometimes that's how people carry it. I know. A pause. I don't mind that you're here. I want you to know that. I wasn't sure at first, but I don't mind now. Marin felt something tighten briefly in her chest. Not pain exactly. Something more like the feeling of stepping onto ground you weren't sure would hold and finding that it did. I'm glad, she said. That was all. The sparrow recovered. By the next morning it was hopping around the inside of the crate and pecking at the breadcrumbs Elsie had put in, and by afternoon Elsie let it go out the kitchen window, and they both watched it fly off in a straight line toward the tree line south of the barn without looking back. That's what you want, Marin said. That's how you know it's all right. Elsie watched until it was gone. Then she went back inside and picked up her school book, and didn't say anything more about it, but there was something different in her shoulders, something slightly less braced. The letters kept coming. Aldrich wrote back from Billings in the third week of February, a longer letter this time, with terms. He was interested in direct purchase agreements with independent ranchers, he said. He'd been trying to build relationships with producers in the Eastern Territory for 2 years, because the Chicago market was hungry for quality fine wool, and most of what was coming through the established trading houses was being blended and graded down before it ever got to serious buyers. If Marin could provide a detailed description of the flock and a projected clip weight, he'd give her a formal quote. She sat with that letter for a long time. Then she did something that was either very smart or a considerable risk. She wrote back and told him the truth. She described the flock accurately, its current condition, its recent losses, the quality of the Rambouillet cross genetics that had always been the operation's real asset. She told him the animals had been under stress from a hard winter but were recovering. She told him the ranch had been selling its clip at artificially low prices through a local broker for several years, and was now looking to establish a direct relationship. She didn't embellish, she didn't soften, she gave him the picture as it was. She brought that letter to Gideon before she sent it. He read it standing at the kitchen table, still in his coat from outside. She watched his face while he read. You told him about Fenner, he said. Not by name. I told him what the situation was. He looked up. Why? Because he's going to see the clip himself in the spring if he comes to buy. He'll be able to tell it's been sold wrong for years just by looking at it. A man who knows fine wool knows what a flock like this should be worth, and he'll know the numbers don't add up. I'd rather he hear it from us first, honestly, than figure it out and wonder why we didn't mention it. Gideon was quiet. He looked at the letter again. It makes us look weak, he said. Admitting we've been cheated. It makes us look honest, she said. There's a difference. A man like Aldrich, who's trying to build relationships with independent ranchers, wants to know he's dealing with people who'll tell him the truth. Being cheated isn't a character flaw. Not seeing it until now isn't ideal, but it's common enough. She looked at him steadily. Hiding it from him would be worse than the original problem. He set the letter down. He took his coat off and hung it on the hook she'd put by the door, the one he now used automatically without seeming to notice it anymore. Send it, he said. She sent it. In March, the cold broke slightly, just enough to be cruel. There were 3 days of relative warmth, the kind that makes you think the worst is over. And then a final freeze came down from the north and settled in with genuine malice. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 6 hours on a Tuesday night, and by Wednesday morning, the water trough in the yard was frozen solid and the barn door had seized in its frame. That was when the first ewe went down. Marin heard it from Gideon at breakfast. He'd found her when he went out for the morning check, a young animal, 2 years old, lying on her side in the corner of the far pen. Not dead yet, but not far from it. She'd shown no signs of particular trouble the day before, which was the terrifying thing about how fast a stressed animal could decline when a final cold pushed them over whatever edge they'd been balancing on. They went out together. Marin went straight to the ewe and knelt in the straw beside her. She was breathing, but the breaths were shallow and irregular, and her gums, when Marin pressed them, were too pale. She's hypothermic, Marin said, and there might be something else underneath it. How long has the water trough been frozen? I broke the ice yesterday morning. By evening, it could have been solid again. So potentially no water since yesterday evening. She looked up at him. Get the extra blankets from the house, the ones in the linen chest, and fill the bucket from the stove reservoir. I need warm water, not hot." He went without arguing. She stayed beside the ewe, keeping her hands on the animal's side, feeling the thin, fast flutter of her breathing. The barn was cold enough that she could see her own breath. Around her, the rest of the flock moved with the uneasy awareness animals have when one of their number is in serious trouble. This was the thing about livestock that people who didn't work with them didn't fully understand. The dying of one animal changed the atmosphere of the whole group. You could feel it. A tension in the air, a different quality to the sounds they made, a drawing together and a drawing away at the same time. Gideon came back with the blankets and the bucket. She showed him how to help her wrap the ewe, close to the body but not so tight it restricted the shallow breathing, and she got warm water into the animal a little at a time using a piece of cloth as a wick. "Stay here with her," she said. "I need to check the rest of the flock." She spent the next 2 hours going through the entire herd. 2 more animals were showing signs she didn't like. Not down, not yet, but moving wrong, standing with that particular hunched quality that meant they were working too hard just to maintain temperature. She increased the feed for the whole flock and got more water moving and documented everything she saw. When she got back to where Gideon was keeping watch with the sick ewe, the animal's breathing had improved. Not dramatically, but the interval between breaths was steadier, less like gasping. "She's holding," Marin said. "Is she going to make it?" "I don't know yet. Another hour will tell us more." She sat down on the straw next to him. Her knees hurt. Her hands were cold in spite of the gloves. "I'm going to write to Dr. Pruitt in Dalton today. Not because I think we need him right now. I think this animal has a reasonable chance if we keep her warm and hydrated, but because I want him to know the situation and be reachable if something changes." Gideon nodded. He had his hand resting on the ewe's side the way Marin had shown him, feeling for the breathing. "You said 2 more are showing signs," he said. "Mild signs. I've increased their rations and I want someone watching them through the afternoon." "I'll stay in the barn," he said. "You go write the letter." She looked at him. "I know how to watch an animal," he said quietly. I know some things have gotten past me, but I know how to watch." "I know you do," she said. "I didn't mean to imply otherwise." He shook his head. "You didn't. I'm saying it because I want to be useful, not because you made me feel like I wasn't." She stood up, her knees complaining. "I'll come back at noon." She went to the house and wrote the letter to Dr. Pruitt and sent Elsie to town with it, because Elsie had been wanting something to do and because the girl rode better than anyone gave her credit for. Then she came back to the barn and stayed through the afternoon. The ewe lived. By evening she was on her feet, unsteady but upright, and by the following morning she was eating, which was the best possible sign. The other 2 animals Marin had flagged held without declining. The March freeze broke on Thursday, for real this time, and the temperature climbed back above freezing and stayed there. They'd come through it, not cleanly. The herd was tired and the ranch was stretched thin, and there were decisions ahead that Marin didn't underestimate. The wool clip in spring would be the thing everything pivoted on. Aldrich had written back, a formal letter with numbers and terms. And the numbers were real, and the terms were fair. And Marin had read that letter 4 times and felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She hadn't told Gideon yet what the number looked like on paper. She was waiting for the right moment. Not because she was hiding anything, but because she'd learned something about Gideon Ashcroft in the past 6 weeks. He needed to come to hope the same way a wary animal comes to water, slowly, without sudden movements, on his own terms. She'd show him the letter tonight, after supper. When Elsie was settled and the house was quiet and there was time to sit with it, she stood in the barn doorway that Thursday afternoon and watched the late winter light come across the plain, pale and thin, but present. Different from February's flat gray. There was angle to it, the kind of angle that meant the season was actually, finally, turning. Somewhere on the south side of the property, she could hear the sheep. The particular sound a flock makes when it settles, not anxious, not restless, just present, just alive. She had a lot of work left to do. She was ready for it. Aldrich's letter sat on the kitchen table through supper that night, weighted down by the salt cellar because the draft from the north window had a habit of moving paper. Gideon read it twice. Marin watched him read it the second time, watching his eyes track back to the number in the middle of the page, 93 cents base, with the possibility of a premium grade assessment once he saw the clip in person. possibly as high as $1.04. She'd done the arithmetic already, 3 different times, and the number that came out was large enough that she'd checked it each time to make sure she hadn't made an error. He set the letter down. "This is real," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I've checked his trading house through 2 sources. He's legitimate, been operating in Billings for 11 years. Gideon picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. "If this is right, if he pays even 93 cents on our clip, it changes the debt picture significantly," she said. "Not completely, not in one season, but significantly." He was quiet. She let him be quiet. Outside, the March wind had finally lost some of its edge. There was still cold in it, but the brutality was going out of it, the way it does when the season has decided to move on, even if the weather hasn't caught up yet. "I want to show this to someone," he said. "Someone who knows the wool business better than either of us." She nodded. "Do you have someone in mind?" "Walt Greer. He ranches north of here, runs merinos. He's dealt with buyers out of Billings before. He and I aren't—" He stopped. "We're not close, but he's straight." "Then talk to him." He folded the letter carefully and put it in his shirt pocket. "I'll ride out tomorrow." He did. He came back in the late afternoon with a different quality to his silence. Not the heavy, carrying silence of someone managing bad news, but the silence of someone who has had a thing confirmed and is still processing what that means. "Greer knows Aldrich," he said, in the kitchen doorway, still in his coat. "Says he's dealt with him twice, fair both times. The prices are accurate. Greer got 91 cents last year for his merino clip, and merino doesn't grade as high as what we're running." Marin set down the bowl she was holding. "And Fenner?" Gideon's jaw tightened. Greer knew about Fenner. Not the specifics, not our specific numbers, but he'd heard things. Not just about us. He paused. "Apparently we're not the only ranch that's been dealing with him." The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. "How many others?" she said. Greer didn't know exactly. 2 others he could name, the Callaway operation east of town, and a widow named Foss who runs a small flock out on the Whitmore Road. He finally came the rest of the way into the kitchen and took his coat off. His movements were careful, the kind of careful that means something is happening underneath them that wants to come out differently. "That woman has been running sheep alone since her husband died, and she's been getting the same prices I have. Maybe worse." Marin thought about that for a moment. A widow running a ranch alone, being charged too much for her grain and paid too little for her wool, and no one, not her neighbors, not the town, had said a word about it to her. "Does she know?" Marin asked. "I don't think so." She nodded slowly. "We should tell her." "I know." He said it like someone who knows the right thing and is also aware that the right thing is going to cost him something. "I'll ride out to the Foss place next week. Walt Greer said he'd come with me." It was a small thing and a large thing at the same time. He hadn't asked her whether he should, he'd just decided. She didn't say anything about that, but she noticed it. Spring announced itself not as an arrival, but as a slow argument that eventually won. Through the last 2 weeks of March, the temperature climbed in irregular steps. Warm one afternoon, hard frost the next morning, warm again, frost again. And the snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, and then retreated further, until there were patches of actual ground visible along the fence lines, brown and matted, but real. The flock responded. It was subtle at first, a quality to how they moved, a slightly better angle to their ears. But by the last week of March, it was unmistakable. Animals that had spent 4 months in survival mode were coming back to themselves, and the barn in the evenings had a different sound to it, more restless and alive. Lambing season began the first week of April. Marin had been preparing for it since February. She'd read everything she could find, had written 2 letters to a sheep farmer in Pennsylvania whose name she'd gotten from a farming almanac, and had reorganized the far pen in the barn into a proper lambing area with extra bedding and a clear line of sight from the door. Gideon had watched this process with an expression that was somewhere between appreciation and something more guarded. The expression of a man who had managed lambing season alone for several years and was recalibrating what managing it looked like with a second set of hands. The first 2 births went fine. Both ewes were experienced mothers, and they handled it without help. And by morning, there were 2 lambs on their feet and nursing, and it was one of those moments that cuts through all the difficulty around it and is just simply good. The third birth was the one that cost them. It was the young ewe, the one Maren and Gideon had pulled back from the edge of death during the March freeze. She'd been Maren's concern all through April. She was 2 years old, first-time mother, and she'd been carrying what felt like a large lamb, and Maren had been checking her twice daily for a week. The night it started, Maren woke at 2 in the morning for no reason she could name. Just woke, the way you do sometimes when something has shifted. She lay still for a moment, listening. The house was quiet. The wind was quiet. She got up. She dressed in the dark and went out to the barn. The night was cold but clear, the stars sharp overhead, frost on the ground crunching under her boots. She opened the barn door and went to the lambing pen. The young ewe was in the corner. She was in labor, which wasn't unexpected. She'd been showing signs for 2 days, but something was wrong with the way she was positioned, the way she kept getting up and lying down again, the particular quality of her distress that was beyond normal laboring difficulty. Maren went in with her. She knelt in the straw and put her hands on the ewe's side and felt the lamb's position, and what she felt sent a cold thread of alarm down her spine. The lamb was turned wrong, not catastrophically wrong, but wrong enough that the ewe wasn't going to manage it without help. She'd read about this. She'd read about it carefully, and she understood the theory, and she had never done it once in her life. She made herself breathe. Then she went to the barn door and called toward the house. Not loudly, Elsie didn't need to wake up, but clearly. She called twice. The light in the upstairs window came on. Gideon was in the barn within 4 minutes, which was faster than she'd thought possible. He came in still pulling his coat on, reading her face when he came through the door before he even looked at the ewe. "What is it?" "The lamb's turned. I need to reposition it before she exhausts herself any further." She looked at him directly. "I know the procedure. I've never done it. If you have—" "I have," he said. "Once. 3 years ago." He was already moving past her, crouching beside the ewe, his hands going to her without hesitation. She stayed close and watched his hands and paid attention to everything, not just what he was doing, but how he was reading the animal, how he knew when to pause and when to move. He was quiet while he worked. His hands were steady in a way that she noted carefully. It took 20 minutes. The barn was lit by one lantern hung on the post, and outside the night was completely still, and inside the only sounds were the ewe's breathing and the low, constant effort of the work. At one point the ewe cried out, a sound that had nothing resigned in it, nothing surrendered, just pure animal determination to get through. And Maren put her hand on the ewe's side and kept it there. "Almost," Gideon said. He said it quietly, to the ewe, or to Maren, or to both of them. The lamb came at 2:43 in the morning. It came out slow and then all at once, the way these things do, and it was alive. Maren heard it make its first sound before it was fully clear, a thin, wet, indignant noise. And she grabbed the clean cloth she'd prepared and cleared the face, and the ewe twisted around and began doing what mothers do. She and Gideon were both kneeling in the straw, and they were both a mess, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. "You were right," he said finally, "about the procedure." "So were you," she said. "Your hands knew what to do." "I wasn't sure they still did." He sat back on his heels. He looked tired in a particular way. Not the tired of the hour, but the tired of someone who has been managing a fear they didn't know they still had and has just found out it wasn't as bad as they thought. "After Clara, after everything, I started to think I'd lost the things I used to be good at." She didn't look at him right away. She was watching the lamb, which was now making exploratory attempts to stand, failing, trying again, falling over in the straw with the magnificent gracelessness of newborn things. "You didn't lose them," she said. "They were just waiting." He didn't answer, but he didn't move away either. They stayed in the lambing pen together for another hour, until the lamb was on its feet and nursing, and the young ewe had settled into the deep, exhausted calm of an animal that has done something hard and survived it. When they finally left the barn, it was past 4 in the morning, and the east horizon had just the faintest suggestion of gray at its edge. They walked back across the yard without speaking, the frost crunching underfoot. At the porch steps, he stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for waking up." "I just woke up. I don't know why." "I know." He said it like he understood there wasn't an explanation worth looking for. "Thank you anyway." She went inside. She stood in the kitchen for a moment in the dark, not ready to go back to sleep, not sure what she was doing. Then she put the kettle on and sat down at the table and waited for the water to boil. The notebook was on the table where she'd left it. She opened it to a new page and wrote the date, and under the date she wrote, "Lamb, female, first-time mother, healthy." Then she sat with the pen in her hand and didn't write anything else for a while. The end of April was when Holt Fenner came to the ranch. She hadn't expected it to happen yet. She'd thought they'd have until the wool clip in late May before any kind of confrontation became unavoidable. She'd been wrong about the timeline, which was a lesson in the way these things work. The person who's been profiting from an arrangement always knows sooner than you think when the arrangement is in danger. Fenner drove out on a Tuesday afternoon in a good wagon with good horses, which told her something about his business. He was a man in his mid-50s, heavy-set, with a pleasant face that had been assembled over many years into an expression of reasonable goodwill that covered something more calculating underneath. She recognized the type. She'd met men like him in other contexts and in other places, and the specific thing she recognized was the way they'd perfected the art of being helpful in ways that primarily helped themselves. She was in the yard when he arrived. She didn't go inside. He climbed down from the wagon and looked at her with the particular assessment of a man deciding how much of a problem you are going to be. "Miss Holloway," he said. He'd learned her name, which didn't surprise her. In a town the size of Blackridge, her arrival had been public knowledge inside of 24 hours. "Holt Fenner. I've been dealing with the Ashcroft operation for some years now." "I know who you are," she said pleasantly. "Is Gideon about?" "He's on the north fence. I can get him, or I can pass along whatever you'd like to discuss." Fenner looked at her steadily. He was deciding something. She let him decide it. "I've heard some things," he said, "about changes being considered with the wool arrangement." "What kind of things?" "That there's been talk of going to outside buyers. Billings people." He said Billings people the way you say something you're not sure of, not quite dismissing it, but not taking it seriously either. "I wanted to come out and make sure Gideon understood the risks involved. Outside buyers, men who don't know this territory, don't know these ranchers, they come out here and they make promises, and then when the clip doesn't grade the way they claimed, the price adjusts. And the rancher's stuck. That's a reasonable concern," Marin said, "for buyers who work that way. Most of them do. Some don't." She kept her voice even. "Mr. Fenner, I appreciate you coming out. I'll pass along your concern to Gideon. He'll want to make his own decision about it." Fenner was quiet for a moment. His pleasant expression held, but there was something working behind it. "You've been here, 3 months?" he said. "Close to that. And you feel like you have a handle on how business works out here?" "I feel like I have a handle on numbers," she said. "They work the same way everywhere." He looked at her for a long moment. The pleasant expression went through a slight adjustment, not disappearing, but acknowledging something. "I'm going to wait for Gideon, if that's all right." "Of course," she said. "There's water for your horse at the trough." She went inside. She stood at the kitchen window where she could see the yard and watched Fenner water his horses and lean against the wagon with the patience of a man who has waited out problems before and is confident he can do it again. Gideon came in from the north fence 40 minutes later. She watched him see the wagon from a distance, watched him slow slightly before he kept coming. He tied his horse and walked toward Fenner, and the two men shook hands with the wariness of people who have done that many times and are doing it differently this time without wanting to show it. She didn't go back outside. She stayed at the window and watched the conversation she couldn't hear, the body language of it, Fenner doing most of the talking, Gideon listening with his arms loose at his sides, his weight back on his heels. She watched Fenner reach into his coat and produce a paper, which he showed to Gideon. Gideon looked at it without touching it. She knew what the paper probably was. A counteroffer. A new price. Better than 62 cents, better than whatever Fenner had calculated she'd uncovered, but still below what Aldrich had offered. Just good enough to look like generosity. She watched Gideon's face from the distance of the kitchen window. He handed the paper back without taking it. Fenner said something. Gideon said something back that was short. Fenner's pleasant expression took a real hit for the first time. She could see it from across the yard, the way something shifted in his shoulders. He folded the paper. He said something else. Gideon shook his head. Fenner got back in his wagon. He was out of the yard within 5 minutes, and his horses were moving faster than they'd come in. Gideon came into the kitchen and took his hat off and stood there for a moment. He offered 78 cents, he said. I thought it would be something like that. He also said that if I go outside the established trading network, I'll have trouble getting fair prices for grain next season. Implied it, anyway. He set his hat down. He wasn't subtle about it. No, she said. People like that usually aren't, once they feel threatened. He looked at her. There was a tiredness in his face, but underneath it something different, something that had the quality of a decision made and held. I told him we'd be dealing with Aldrich this spring, he said. I told him the arrangement was done. She let out a breath. How did that feel? He thought about it. Like taking a step off a ledge, he said. And the ground was further down than I expected, but I'm still standing. She almost smiled. That's generally how it works. He sat down at the kitchen table. He looked at the notebook she'd left there, and then at her. What do we need to do before the clip? She sat down across from him and pulled the notebook over and opened it to the page she'd been building for 2 weeks. The preparation list, the contacts, the timeline. It was the longest page in the notebook. Everything on here, she said. We have about 4 weeks. He pulled the notebook toward him and read down the page. His brow furrowed at a few things. The shearing crew she'd been in contact with in Miles City, the samples she'd proposed sending to Aldrich in advance, the fence repairs on the south boundary that needed to happen before the flock moved to spring pasture. The south fence, he said. I can do that this week. I'll help. He looked up. You don't have to. I know, she said. I want to. It'll go faster. He looked at her for a moment, the same look she'd seen in the barn in January, the one she still couldn't entirely name, like trying to read water in low light. All right, he said. We start Thursday. Outside, the April evening was coming in mild and clean, the sky going from blue to a pale gold in the west. In the barn, the lambing pen held 4 healthy animals now. The notebook was open on the table between them, full of plans that were real and specific and achievable. It wasn't easy. Nothing about the next 4 weeks would be easy. But Marin had stopped measuring things by easy a long time ago. She measured them by worth it, by possible, by the difference between what things were and what they could be with enough work and enough honesty. The south fence needed fixing. The wool clip needed to be the best it could be. Aldrich needed to see what this flock really was. And Holt Fenner, driving back toward Blackridge in the early evening with his counteroffer unaccepted and his arrangement finished, would be thinking about what came next. So was she. The south fence took 4 days. Not because it was beyond them. Between the two of them, working steadily, it was manageable work. But because the ground in the low section near the creek had heaved badly over the winter, and 3 posts needed to come out entirely and be reset, which meant digging in soil that was still half frozen 2 feet down and didn't care about their timeline. Marin's hands were wrecked by the end of the 2nd day. She didn't say anything about it. She wrapped them at night with the cloth she'd been using for barn work and went back out the next morning. Gideon noticed, she saw him notice, the way his eyes went to her hands when she picked up the wire stretcher. But he didn't say anything either, which she appreciated. She wasn't looking for sympathy. She was looking to get the fence done. They worked in the particular rhythm that develops between 2 people who have figured out how to be alongside each other without constant negotiation. She'd pull the wire taut. He'd drive the staple. He'd set the post level. She'd hold the brace while the concrete they'd mixed with creek water started to set. It wasn't elegant. There were moments of miscommunication. Twice she anticipated a move he didn't make once he went ahead of her when she wasn't ready. And both times they sorted it out without drama, without anyone needing to be right about it. On the 3rd afternoon, while they were working the middle section where the wire had snapped under ice weight and needed splicing, Gideon said without looking up from what he was doing, Greer came to see me yesterday. She kept working. What did he say? That Fenner's been talking in town, telling people I've gone outside the local network, making it sound like He paused, working the splice. Like I've been disloyal to the community, to the way things work out here. She thought about that for a moment. Is anyone listening? Some people. Calloway told Greer he's thinking of staying with Fenner. Doesn't want the trouble. He set down the pliers and looked at the splice. Can't say I blame him. You do blame him a little, she said. He glanced at her. Maybe a little, he said, and there was something close to dry humor in it, which was a quality she'd been finding in him more frequently over the past weeks. It had always been there, she thought. It had just been buried under a lot of weight. Benner's going to push harder before the clip, she said. He's going to want to make an example of this. If we succeed, if we go to Aldrich and it works, then he loses the argument that outside buyers can't be trusted. He loses the cover story he's been using. I know. Gideon picked up the pliers again. He came to the bank. She stopped what she was doing. What do you mean? Rand Hollis at the bank. He handles the ranch's notes. Benner went to see him. He kept his voice steady, but she could hear what it was costing him to keep it that way. Hollis told me about it because he thought I should know. Benner was asking about the terms of the debt, whether there were any clauses that could be called early. The cold that went through her had nothing to do with the air temperature. Can they be? Hollis said no. The notes are standard term. They run through next March. He can't call them early without cause. He paused. But Fenner was looking. She went back to what she was doing, because stopping wouldn't help either of them. Then we make sure he doesn't find cause, she said. We close out the clip, we pay down as much debt as we can, and we come to March in a better position than he's planning for. That's the plan, he said. It's still the plan, she said. Nothing he's doing changes the numbers. He looked at her. You're not worried. I'm worried, she said honestly. I just don't find it useful to show. He held her gaze for a moment, and then he went back to the fence, and they worked through the rest of the afternoon without talking much. But the silence was the right kind. Not the silence of things unresolved, but the silence of two people who have said what needs saying and are now getting on with what needs doing. The fence was finished by Friday noon. The shearing crew arrived from Miles City on the second Monday of May. 4 men in a wagon with their own equipment, led by a wiry, efficient man named Tom Bauer, who had been shearing sheep for 20 years and looked it. He walked the flock with Marin before he started, assessing what he was working with. Good frame on these animals, he said, moving along the pen fence with his eyes running over the ewes. Rambouillet cross? Yes. They've had a hard winter. Some of them are thinner than they should be. I can see that. Won't affect the fleece quality if the genetics are right. Might affect the weight. He stopped at the pen where the young ewe, the one from the terrible night in April, stood with her lamb beside her. The lamb was 6 weeks old now and had been named by Elsie, who had settled on the name Barley because the lamb was exactly the color of dried barley grass. First time mother? Yes. She did all right? She needed help. She's done well since. Bauer nodded. He looked at Marin with the frank, sizing-up expression of a craftsman assessing whether the person commissioning the work knows what they're talking about. Apparently she passed because he said, We'll start on the east pen. My boys are good, but they work fast. Fast isn't always careful. You want to watch the skirting, make sure the edge fleece is being handled right. I'll be there, she said. Gideon had given her the lead on this. Not formally, there had been no conversation where he'd said the words, but she'd felt it shift somewhere in the past week, felt him step back slightly on the wool-related decisions and let her move forward. It wasn't abdication. He was still there, still present in every discussion, still the one who owned the land and the animals. But he'd stopped second-guessing her judgment on the wool side, and the feeling of working without that particular friction was something she hadn't realized she'd been missing until it was gone. The shearing took 3 days. Marin was in the barn for most of it, watching, learning from Bauer's hands the things she'd understood theoretically and now saw in practice. The fleeces came off in remarkable condition, better than she'd expected given the hard winter. The genetics were real. This flock had good blood in it, and good blood didn't disappear because of one bad season. She skirted alongside Bauer on the second afternoon, removing the edge wool and the stained sections, handling each fleece with the care she'd read about and now understood the reason for. Clean, well-skirted wool graded higher. Every half grade was money. Elsie came to the barn on the second day and sat on a hay bale and watched. She didn't ask to help, but she watched everything with the careful attention that was becoming characteristic of her. The quality of a child who has learned that watching carefully is a form of participation. It doesn't hurt them? She asked Bauer during a pause. He looked up. He had a way with children, not falsely cheerful, just straight. Nope. Feels better after, most of them. Like taking off a heavy coat in summer. Elsie considered this. Barley seems upset. Barley's a lamb, and lambs don't like changes in how their mothers smell, Bauer said. She'll figure it out by tonight. Elsie seemed satisfied with this answer and went back to watching. By the end of the third day, they had the clip organized into 3 grades. The bulk of the fleeces in the top 2, bagged and ready. Marin had kept meticulous records, each bag numbered, grade noted, weight recorded. She'd written to Aldrich 2 weeks before with the estimated clip and the general quality description, and he'd written back to confirm he'd make the trip from Billings personally. He arrived on a Thursday, which was a gray morning that threatened rain but didn't deliver it. He was not what Marin had imagined from the letters. She'd constructed a picture of a formal trading house type, city clothes, careful manner, and instead the man who climbed down from the stage at the Blackridge Depot was somewhere in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been outdoors for most of its existence. He shook her hand first, which she noted, and then Gideon's, and he said he'd appreciate a cup of coffee before they went to look at the clip, which she'd already anticipated. In the kitchen, with coffee, he was straightforward. "I got your sample fleece 3 weeks ago," he said, talking to both of them, his hands around the cup. "It graded out exactly where you described it, actually a touch above. There's a fineness to the fiber in this clip that's genuinely good." He looked at Gideon. "Your Rambouillet blood. Where'd it come from originally?" "My wife's father started the flock," Gideon said. "He bought the foundation stock from a breeder in Oregon, 1871. Good source. It shows." Aldrich set his cup down. "I want to be straight with you about where I'm at. I'm looking to build direct relationships with 3, maybe 4 ranchers in this territory. I've been burned by clip quality that didn't match what I was told. I came all this way, saw the actual wool, and it was blended down and misrepresented. So I'm careful." He looked at Marin. "Your letter told me things I didn't expect to hear about the previous arrangement. I thought you should know the full picture," she said. "I appreciated it. It told me the kind of people I was dealing with." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm also aware that Holt Fenner has been asking questions about my business in this territory. So I know there's some pressure on this situation." Gideon said, "Does that change anything for you?" "No," Aldrich said simply. "I don't work with middlemen like Fenner, and I don't let them influence who I deal with. If the wool is what you say it is, we do business." He looked at the clip for 2 hours. Marin stood back for most of it and let him work, which was its own kind of discipline. She had opinions about every fleece in every bag, and she kept them to herself and watched his face instead. He was thorough. He opened bags, pulled samples, assessed the staple length and crimp and fineness with the experienced hands of someone who had done this enough times that the information came directly through his fingers. He didn't talk while he worked. That was fine. She didn't need him to talk. When he was done, he came to where she and Gideon were standing near the barn door, and he named his price. He said, $1.02 a pound on the top grade, 94 on the second grade. I'll buy the full clip. The number landed in the barn like something physical. Marin heard Gideon take a breath. She did the arithmetic in her head. She'd been doing versions of it for weeks, running different scenarios. At $1.02 on the top grade and the clip weight she'd recorded, the total came to just over $900 before Bauer's shearing costs. $900. Against the debt on this ranch, $900 was not a complete solution. But it was a turning. It was the kind of number that meant the next year looked different from this one, and the year after that looked different again. "That's fair," she said. She kept her voice level. Aldrich looked at her. "That's below what some Chicago houses would give you if you went direct." "I'll tell you that straight. But I cover the freight, I pay within 15 days of receipt, and I don't adjust the price after the fact based on grading disputes. What I said here is what I pay." "We understand that," Gideon said. "Then we have a deal?" Gideon looked at Marin. She looked at him. There was a moment, brief, contained, where something passed between them that wasn't about the wool at all. It was about the winter, and the notebook, and the south fence, and the 2 in the morning in the lambing pen, and the 6 grieving ewes who had survived, and all the other things that a season like this one was made of when you took it apart. "We have a deal," Gideon said. They shook hands. Then Aldrich shook Marin's hand again and said he'd arranged transport of the clip within the week, and asked about the prospect of a longer-term arrangement for future seasons, and Gideon said he was open to discussing it. Aldrich stayed for supper. Marin cooked, which she did without self-consciousness, and Elsie sat at the table and asked Aldrich 3 careful questions about where he'd come from and what Billings looked like, which he answered with genuine patience. After he left, Gideon sat at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. "Say it," Marin said. She was washing the supper dishes. "I'm trying to figure out what to say." "Say the number." He was quiet. Then, $912, roughly, after Bauer. "Yes. That's almost—" He stopped. She heard the chair shift. "That's almost as much as Fenner shorted us over 4 years." She didn't say anything. She kept washing. "If I had just—" He stopped again. "Don't," she said, not unkindly. "Don't do that to yourself tonight. There'll be time for looking back at it later if you need to. Tonight it's just the number, and it's a good number, and it's real." She heard him breathe out, a long, slow breath that had a lot in it. "You're right," he said. "I know." She turned from the sink and looked at him. He looked like a man who had been carrying something for so long he'd forgotten the original shape of the weight, and now that it had shifted, he didn't quite know how to stand. "The debt. Walk me through what's left." He went and got the papers from the bureau in the parlor, the notes, the bank documents, the accounts she'd been working with since January. They spread them on the table, and for the next hour they worked through it together, the same way they'd worked through everything, methodically, honestly, without pretending it was simpler than it was. By the end of that hour, the picture was clear. Not good in every respect. There was still a significant note outstanding with Hollis at the bank, and the ranch needed money put into equipment in the next year before things would really be stable. But the trajectory had changed. The numbers were moving the right direction. "We can pay down a third of the main note this season," Marin said, "if we're careful with the rest." "That's more than I've paid in 3 years," he said. "Then we do it." He nodded. He gathered the papers and straightened them with the careful movements of someone who is handling something they now see differently than they did an hour ago. He set them aside. "I should have—" he started. "Gideon? I know, you told me not to. I told you not to tonight. If you need to say it, say it." He was quiet. He looked at the papers. Then, "I should have paid more attention to all of it, for a long time." His voice was quiet and direct, the way it was when he decided to say something plainly. "I let things go because it was easier than paying attention when things were already so hard. And it cost the ranch, and it could have cost Elsie her home, and I need to say that plainly so I can stop carrying it like something I can't say." She was quiet for a moment. "All right," she said. "You said it." He looked at her. "Now it's said," she said, "and you can put it down." He looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen was warm, the lamp burning low, the house quiet around them. Outside, the May evening was mild and real, and the plains ran out in every direction under a sky that had more light in it at this hour than seemed possible. "When you came here," he said slowly, "you had $43 and a broken bag." She raised her eyebrows slightly. "You knew about the bag?" "Mrs. Pelham mentioned it. She noticed everything." The corner of his mouth moved. "You came here with almost nothing, and you—" He stopped. He seemed to be choosing words with more care than usual, which, for Gideon Ashcroft, was saying something. "I don't know how to say this without it sounding wrong." "Say it wrong, then." He looked at the table, looked up. "I'm glad you answered the letter," he said. "I'm glad you stayed when you could have gone. I'm glad you went through my accounts and wrote to Aldrich and fixed the hinge on the root cellar and made those curtains for Elsie's room." He paused. "I'm glad you were in the barn at 2 a.m. She felt something move in her chest. She held it still. "So am I," she said. It was not a declaration of anything. It was just two people in a kitchen at the end of a long, hard season, being honest with each other, which was the only real language they'd ever used. But it was the first time the honesty had moved in that particular direction, and they both knew it. Outside, the May evening deepened toward dark. In the barn, the flock was quiet. The lambs were sleeping. Somewhere in the southern field, a nighthawk was working the last of the light, cutting clean arcs across the pale sky. Hunting. In the morning, there would be work. There was always work. But tonight, in the kitchen, with the lamp burning and the papers on the table and $900 of real money on its way to the bank, things were different than they had been. Not fixed, not finished, but different in the specific way that matters. The way that means the difference between something failing and something beginning, between what was and what might still be. Marin blew out the lamp and went to bed. She slept without waking for the first time since February. Aldrich's payment arrived 15 days later, exactly as he'd said it would. The bank draft came by post on a Tuesday morning in late May, and Marin brought it in from the mailbox and set it on the kitchen table without making a production of it. Gideon came in from the morning feeding and saw the envelope and looked at her, and she nodded, and he sat down and opened it. He held the draft for a long moment. She could see his jaw working slightly, the small, involuntary movement of a man managing something he doesn't want to show. $914, he said. He rounded up. He said he would if the clip weighed above estimate. Gideon set it down. He put both hands flat on the table. He stared at the number on the draft the way you stare at something you've been believing in for a long time without being certain it was real. "I'm going to ride to the bank this morning," he said. "I know. I'll have the paydown figures ready when you get back. I worked through the interest calculations last night." He looked up at her. There was something in his face that he didn't try to manage or contain, something plain and open that she'd seen only a few times before, always in the quiet moments, never when he was performing the business of being a functioning person. "You did that last night?" "I couldn't sleep," she said, which was true in only the strictest sense. She'd been awake, but it wasn't restlessness. It was the particular alertness that comes when something you've been working toward for months is finally happening and your mind hasn't yet agreed to treat it as ordinary. He picked up the bank draft and folded it into his shirt pocket with the care of someone handling a thing that matters. Then he got up and got his hat and went to saddle his horse, and Marin poured herself the last of the coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched him ride out of the yard. The morning was clear. The grass in the south field had come in green and real over the past 3 weeks, and the flock was out on it. 163 animals now, counting the surviving lambs, moving across the hillside in the loose, unhurried way of sheep that are well-fed and unstressed. Barley was visible near the east fence, still following the young ewes so closely you could tell them apart from the barn. She thought about what it had cost to get to this morning. Not in money, though the money was real and the money mattered, but in the other currencies. The February nights and the frozen fence posts and the notebook full of numbers and the letters she'd written on the chance that someone somewhere was operating honestly. The sparrow in Elsie's hands and the lamb coming out wrong in the dark, and the two of them kneeling in the straw. The things said plainly between her and Gideon, and the things not yet said. She didn't think of herself as someone who had rescued this place. That wasn't how it felt from the inside. From the inside, it felt like she'd arrived somewhere that had good bones and bad circumstances and had simply paid attention, done the work, refused to be discouraged by what she couldn't change and focused on what she could. She'd been told her whole life that stubbornness was a flaw. She was starting to think the people who'd told her that had personal reasons for preferring she be less so. Gideon came back from town in the early afternoon with a receipt from Hollis at the bank, and the particular lightness of a man who has put down a portion of a weight he's carried so long he'd stopped noticing the way it bent him. Hollis said it's the largest single paydown he's seen on a ranch note in 3 years, Gideon said. How did he look when he said that? Like he wasn't sure whether to congratulate me or explain to me how it happened. Marin almost smiled. What did you say? I said thank you and came home. He hung his hat on the hook. Fenner was in the bank when I got there. Came in after me. He saw the transaction. He paused. He didn't say anything, just watched. She thought about that. How did that feel? Gideon considered it honestly, the way he considered most things. Complicated, he said. I wanted to say something to him. I didn't. Good. Because it wouldn't change anything? Because you don't owe him a scene. What he did is already done. The money he took isn't coming back, not from a confrontation in a bank lobby. She looked at him. If there's ever a way to pursue it formally, through the Territory Trade Commission or some other channel, that's worth exploring. But that's a different conversation for a different time. Right now, the work is here. He nodded slowly. You're not angry at him. I am angry at him, she said matter-of-factly. I just don't let it drive. Anger's useful when it's fuel. It's not useful when it's the whole engine. He looked at her for a moment in the way he had, that river water look, something moving underneath that she understood better now than she had in January, even if she still couldn't always name it. Where did you learn that? From making the other choice for a long time and seeing what it got me. She picked up the receipt from the table where he'd set it. I want to show you the remaining figures. After the paydown, if the fall clip is close to what this one was... Marin, she stopped. He was still standing near the door, his hands loose at his sides, and he had the look of a man who has been composing something and has decided the composed version isn't what he actually wants to say. The figures can wait 20 minutes, he said. She set the receipt down. He crossed the kitchen in a way that wasn't dramatic. It was just walking, just closing distance. And he stopped when there was a reasonable amount of space still between them, which she appreciated because it wasn't a presumption. It was a question. I've been trying to figure out the right way to say something for about 3 weeks, he said. You said it wrong last time and it came out fine, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. That's true. He looked at her directly. You came here as an arrangement. I wrote you a letter that read like a job posting and you answered it because you needed somewhere to land, and that was the honest shape of it, and I knew it. Yes, she said. What it is now isn't the same thing. He said it plainly, the way he said things when he decided to say them. I don't know exactly what it is, but it's not the same thing. And I'm not asking you to. I'm not making demands on anything. He stopped. I think you should know that the way I see you has changed. And the way I see this, us, here, all of it, it's changed. She was quiet. She looked at him in the clear afternoon light coming through the kitchen window. This man who was not easy and not simple, who had made mistakes and carried grief badly and trusted the wrong person for too long and was standing in his kitchen trying to say something true without dressing it up. She thought about what she'd told herself when she'd answered his letter, that she was coming because she had nothing behind her and needed somewhere to land, that it was practical, that she wasn't expecting anything from it beyond shelter and work and the bare minimum of a livable life. She hadn't been wrong, exactly. She'd just been incomplete. The way I see it has changed too, she said. I think you know that. I thought so, he said. I wasn't sure enough to assume. Good, she said. Don't assume, ask. He almost smiled. I'm asking. I know, she said. I'm telling you the answer is yes. He reached out, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who doesn't make careless movements, and took her hand which was rough and scarred from fencing work and cold, and everything else the last 6 months had demanded of it. He held it without making anything of the state it was in, which told her more than a great deal of words would have. They stood in the kitchen for a minute, just that. And it wasn't perfect, and it wasn't the movies. It was two tired people with complicated histories and a great deal of work still ahead of them, standing in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and the outdoors, being honest with each other the only way they knew how. Then Marin picked up the receipt with her free hand and said, Now look at the figures. And he laughed. A real laugh. Not the almost laugh she'd been collecting for months. And they sat down at the table and went through the numbers together. Summer came to the Ashcroft Ranch like a reasonable person, arriving after a long journey. Not with drama, just steadily, in increments, the days growing longer and the light shifting from the cold silver of spring into something warmer and more settled. The flock went to full pasture in the first week of June. Marin walked the fence lines before they moved the animals the way she'd been doing since February, and for the first time in months, she found nothing critical. The north fence had been done in winter. The south fence was the work of those 4 days in April. The east line had needed minor repairs in May. She and Gideon had done those together in an afternoon, working faster now. The communication between them, the communication of people who know each other's rhythm. The ranch had a rhythm now. That was the thing she noticed most in June, the presence of a rhythm that had been missing when she arrived. Feed at the same time, check the flock at the same time, maintenance scheduled and tracked rather than responded to only in crisis. Gideon had always known how to work hard. What he hadn't had was the system underneath the work that made the hard work accumulate instead of just sustaining a slow decline. That was what the notebook had been, really. Not a record of numbers, but the beginning of a system. A way of paying attention that didn't depend on any single person's memory or energy on any given day. He'd started keeping his own sections of it in May. She'd noticed it one evening, found the notebook on the kitchen table with entries she hadn't made, his handwriting careful and somewhat cramped, noting the condition of 3 animals he'd been watching. She hadn't said anything about it. She'd just read the notes, found them accurate and useful, and left the notebook where it was. The next morning he'd said, offhandedly, I added to the records. I saw, she'd said. The observation on number 82 is right. I've been watching her too. That had been that. The town's opinion of the Ashcroft Ranch underwent its own quiet adjustment through early summer, the way community opinions always move, not in declarations, but in the accumulation of small acknowledgments. Walt Greer stopped by in June, ostensibly to look at a fence post tool Gideon had mentioned, and stayed for 2 hours. He shook Marin's hand when he arrived and said, without preamble, "Heard you got a fair price from Aldrich." "We did," she said. "I'm going to write to him about next season's clip," he said. He said it simply, like he'd decided and was just informing them. "If that's all right with you." "Of course," Gideon said. "I'll give you his contact." Greer nodded. He looked at the flock in the south field. "They look better than they did in March." "They are better," Marin said. He looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated assessment of a man who has made up his mind. "You're staying, then?" It wasn't quite a question. "Yes," she said. He nodded again, like something had been confirmed that he'd needed confirming, and went to look at the fence post tool. The widow Foss came by in early July. She was a small woman, somewhere in her late 40s, with weathered hands and the carriage of someone who has managed alone for so long that self-sufficiency had become the only posture she knew. Her name was Ada. She arrived in a light wagon on a Wednesday morning and asked to speak to Marin, which surprised Marin more than she let on. They sat on the porch with coffee. "I heard about the wool prices," Ada said. She didn't ease into things, which Marin respected immediately. "What you figured out about Fenner?" "Gideon talked to you?" "Greer talked to me. Gideon came out in March like he said he would, but I wasn't ready to hear it then." She looked at her coffee cup. "It's a hard thing to sit with, the idea that someone's been doing that and you didn't see it." "I know," Marin said. "I've been running that flock alone for 6 years. I thought I was doing all right." Her voice was very steady, which meant she'd been working at that steadiness. "Turns out all right and actually all right are different things." "Yes," Marin said, "they are." Ada looked at her directly. "I want to write to your buyer, Aldrich. I want to see if he'll look at my clip next season." "I'll write to him myself and introduce you," Marin said. "I'll send the letter this week." Ada was quiet for a moment. Something moved in her expression, not softness exactly, more like the look of someone releasing a breath they've been holding longer than they realized. "Thank you," she said. Just that. "You'd have found your way to it," Marin said. "Maybe," Ada said, "but it would have taken longer." They sat for a while after that, not talking much, watching the flock in the field and the summer light moving across the plain. It wasn't a comfortable silence exactly. They didn't know each other well enough for that, but it was the silence of two women who understood something similar about the particular kind of tired that comes from holding things together with not quite enough. After Ada left, Marin stood on the porch for a while. She thought about something her grandfather used to say, not in a wise old man way, he wasn't that kind of person, but more as an observation, that you didn't know what kind of person you were until you were put somewhere hard and found out what you did there. She'd spent a lot of her life before Blackridge being put somewhere hard and then leaving. Not from cowardice, exactly. More from the particular kind of exhaustion that comes when hard piles on hard, and there's nothing tethering you to the spot. What had been different here was the nothing left to lose. She'd arrived with so little that retreat wasn't really available. You can't go back when there's nowhere to go back to. So she'd stayed, at first because she had to, then because she wanted to, and then because wanting to had turned into something she didn't have a clean word for, but recognized as the thing people mean when they talk about belonging somewhere. She'd never belonged somewhere before. Not in the way that felt like a choice freely made, not like something she'd built herself. She hadn't understood until now that belonging is usually something you make, not something you find, that it's less like discovering a place that was waiting for you and more like the slow work of making a place real through the act of caring for it. The ranch had needed someone to care for it. So had Gideon. So had Elsie, in the particular way that a child who has been loved and then lost part of that love needs someone to be steady and present and honest without pretending to replace what was gone. Marin hadn't tried to replace Clara. She wasn't Clara, and Elsie knew the difference, and the knowing of the difference was important. What she'd tried to be, and thought she'd managed, imperfectly and with mistakes along the way, was present, consistently, reliably present, which was its own kind of love, and sometimes the most important kind. In the second week of July, Elsie found Captain. The gray Tom had been gone since October, 9 months, and they'd all quietly given up on him, in the way you give up on things you haven't formally given up on. He appeared one evening at the barn door, thin and with a notch in one ear that hadn't been there when he left. And he walked in like he'd been gone 20 minutes and helped himself to the barn cat's food bowl with the absolute assurance of an animal who has never doubted his welcome. Elsie found him there the next morning. Marin was in the kitchen when she heard the sound from the barn. Not a cry exactly, and not a shout. Something between them. She went out to find Elsie kneeling in the straw with the gray Tom in her arms, his motor running at a volume that seemed improbable for his size, and Elsie's face buried in his fur. Marin stood at the barn door and didn't go in. Some moments don't need company, some moments are complete exactly as they are, and the kindest thing you can do is leave them alone. She went back to the kitchen and put water on for oats and let Elsie have her barn and her cat, and whatever that reunion meant to a girl who had been losing things since she was 5 years old and had just, for once, gotten something back. Gideon came in from the north field 20 minutes later, and she told him, and he stood in the kitchen doorway and didn't say anything for a moment. "She's all right," he said. "She's very all right," Marin said. He leaned against the door frame. He had a look on his face that he didn't try to do anything with. "Good," he said. "That's good." By August, the ranch's numbers looked like this. The main note at Hollis's bank was down by a third. The flock had stabilized at 167 animals after 2 late lamb losses that had hurt but not broken the season's tally. The relationship with Aldrich was formalized into a 2-season agreement at the same prices, with a provision to reassess grade premiums based on each clip's actual quality. The feed was being sourced from a merchant in Dalton who charged fair prices and didn't ask questions about why a new customer had appeared, though he probably knew. Fenner's business had contracted. Marin didn't track it actively. She had no particular interest in his difficulties beyond the abstract satisfaction of cause and effect, but Greer mentioned in passing that 2 other ranchers had stopped using his wool brokerage, and she'd heard from Ada Foss that the feed prices at his merchant house had dropped noticeably in June, the kind of drop that happens when you've been charging too much, and suddenly the people you've been charging too much start going elsewhere. She didn't feel triumphant about it. She felt something more like tired in a way that was also satisfied. The way you feel after work that was hard and necessary and is now done. She was under no illusion that they'd fixed everything or that the road ahead was cleared. The ranch still needed investment in equipment that they couldn't quite afford yet. The second note at the bank, a smaller one from an emergency repair 3 winters ago, was still outstanding. There would be more hard winters because there always were, and more situations she didn't see coming because there always were those too. She'd stopped thinking of that as a reason for despair somewhere around March, in the barn, next to a ewe that might not survive, and a man who was steadier than he knew. Hardship was not a problem to be solved. It was a condition to be managed, and there was a difference. You managed it with honesty and records and good relationships, and a willingness to ask questions that made other people uncomfortable, and to say out loud the things that everyone else was quietly deciding not to mention. You managed it with help, when you were willing to accept it, and with being willing to help in turn, when you were able. On a Sunday evening in the middle of August, Gideon asked her to walk the north fence with him. This was not unusual. They walked the fence lines regularly. It was part of the routine. But there was something particular about the way he asked, a slight difference in the phrasing, and she noticed it. The north fence was in good repair. There was nothing specifically to inspect. They walked it anyway, in the late evening light that made the plains look different from every other time of day, older somehow, and also more possible. "I want to ask you something," he said, when they were out far enough from the house that it was just the 2 of them, and the land, and the sky. "Ask," she said. He was quiet for a few steps. She let him be quiet. "The arrangement we came to," he said, "when you first got here, it was practical. It was what it needed to be." "Yes. I want to make it a different kind of arrangement," he said. "A permanent one, if you want that." She looked at him. The evening light was going gold and long across the grass, and somewhere in the middle distance the flock was moving. That sound they made, the particular low sound that she had come to know, the way she knew the sound of wind in specific trees, The way you know sounds that have been your daily life long enough to stop being background and start being home. You're asking me to marry you, she said. I am. He looked at her steadily. Not because of the ranch, not because of what you've done here, though I'm not going to pretend that isn't part of who you are and who you've been here, but because of... He stopped. He was working at something. Because of who you are when things are hard, because of how you say true things, because you went through my accounts without asking, and it turned out to be the thing that saved us. The corner of his mouth moved. And because Elsie told me 2 weeks ago that she hopes you stay forever, and she doesn't say things like that, and when she does, I pay attention. Marin felt something happen in her chest that she didn't try to describe or contain. Elsie said that? She said. Verbatim. I hope Marin stays forever. Then she went back to reading her book like she hadn't just... He shook his head. She's something, that kid. She is, Marin said. She really is. She looked out across the plain. She looked at the flock and the fence and the barn visible in the distance and the house with smoke coming from the kitchen chimney because she'd banked the stove before they left. She thought about the train platform in January. She thought about $43 and a broken bag clasp and a letter that read like a job posting. She thought about number 4 standing in the winter light, tentatively deciding to keep going. She thought about how much of life was exactly that. The tentative decision to keep going, made in circumstances where keeping going seemed unreasonable, made because the alternative was worse, made and then made again every day, until one day it wasn't tentative anymore. Yes, she said. He reached over and took her hand, her rough, scarred, capable hand, the same way he'd taken it in the kitchen in May, and they stood in the evening light and looked at their land together. Their land. She turned the phrase over in her mind and found that it fit. They walked back to the house as the last of the light went out of the sky. Elsie was at the kitchen table with Captain on her lap and a school book open in front of her, though she appeared to be paying more attention to the cat than the book. She looked up when they came in, looked at their faces with the acute attention of a child who has learned to read adults carefully, and something in what she saw made her go very still. Well, she said. Well, Gideon said. Elsie looked at Marin. Yes, Marin said. Elsie looked back down at her book. Captain shifted on her lap and reset his rumbling motor. After a moment she said, without looking up, I knew you'd say yes. Did you? Marin said. You don't leave things, Elsie said simply. I figured that out in February. Marin stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and looked at this girl who had lost her mother and learned to protect herself by going quiet, and had slowly, in the way of things that happen when the conditions are right and the patience is real, decided to open back up. Who had held a dying sparrow with absolute concentration. Who had cried into a gray cat's fur without an audience. Who had told her father, in her careful way, exactly what she needed. There was nothing that tied a person to a place like being known there, like having someone look at you over months and seasons and hard moments and say, I see the shape of you, I know what you do when things are difficult, you stay. There was nothing more valuable in a life than that. Not money, not safety, not even love in the abstract sense people talk about it. Just the specific hard-won knowledge of being truly seen by the people who matter, in a place you've made real through the work of your own hands. The kitchen smelled like wood smoke and coffee, and the particular smell of a house that has been lived in and cared for. Through the window, the August night was warm and full of stars. Marin Holloway, soon to be something else, though she thought she'd keep the name alongside it, because the name was hers and she'd earned it, went to put supper on the stove. She had $43 when she arrived. She had a cracked trunk and a broken clasp and the ruins of a previous life and the stubbornness that had been called a flaw by everyone who'd preferred she be easier to manage. What she had now was harder to count but easier to carry. A ranch on solid ground, a flock that had survived the worst winter in 12 years. A man who said true things and meant them, a girl who held dying things with her whole heart, and a notebook full of records that proved what careful attention could do when you applied it long enough and honestly enough to something worth saving. It wasn't a perfect life. It was better than that. It was a real one. Outside, the plains ran out to the horizon in every direction, wide and indifferent and full of everything a life needed if you were willing to work for it. The fire burned in the stove. The stars came out over Black Ridge doing what they'd always done, Marin cooked supper, Elsie read her book, Captain purred, and out in the south field, in the warm August dark, the flock moved through the grass the way they always did, slowly, together, alive.